Hi everybody, it's Sally here, and today I'm going to be doing my second video in my LK150 series. We're going to be starting to talk about casting on. There'll be two casting on videos. This first one will talk about open and temporary forms of cast on, and then the second one will do closed cast ons and so forth. Open and closed are exactly as described. On an open cast on edge, you have open loops of the knitting. It's not secured in any way, and of course it will come undone. And likewise with any other kind of temporary form of cast on, they're not firm enough to be an edge for a knitted piece. So why have an open cast on? Well, there are several times when an open cast on is perfectly adequate for your needs. The main advantage about doing them this way is that it's a lot quicker, because you can just whip the carriage across the knitting and then use your comb or your cord to secure the first row of loops, and away you go. You're not spending time e-wrapping or latching across, and likewise with the cast off at the end, you can just drop it off the machine. You don't have to secure the cast off. And in most cases, as long as you treat the piece that you've knitted with a reasonable amount of respect, don't tug it and pull it apart. On things like this, I actually did this on my standard gauge machine, but as you can see that the bottom edge is open loops, and if I pull it, yes, it'll come undone. But I've got several rows of waist knitting here. At top, that's the bottom, and this is the top, and I'd have to give it a serious amount of tugging to pull all of that waist yarn off and ruin my swatch. So for things like that, it's perfectly okay. You also will need open edges when you start to knit hems, because you need to have an open line of loops to pick up to form the hem. So an open cast on first with waist yarn and then transfer to your main yarn. You're not going to waste time closing an edge on a waist yarn cast on when you're going to rip it all off later. It's just counterproductive. It's pretty pointless. So an open cast on is perfectly okay. The first one I'm going to show you is as shown in the book. This LK150 instruction book is fine up to a point, but its main sins are of omission. There's quite a lot of stuff in here that I think, well, why haven't they shown you how to do this or this? There we go. This is what I'm going to be doing now. I'm going to be filling in the gaps for you, showing you what they haven't put in the book. This is, as far as I can see, this is the only cast-on method that they actually tell you how to do, which is a bit strange because it isn't suitable as a finished edge on anything. Very odd. The only other one I can find is up the back of the book, which is for, on page 41, which is for how to do knit one purl one rib, and this requires hand latching and reforming all these stitches. You have to drop them down and latch them back up again to make knit one purl one rib, because this doesn't have a ribber, this machine. It's actually a technique that I hate and I never do it, but I will probably end up demonstrating it for you at some point, even though I dislike it. I prefer and find it personally much quicker, because I'm quite a competent hand knitter. I find it much quicker to just start on waist yarn and hand knit my ribs afterwards if I want a ribbed edge. But anyway, back to page 10. Just check that you've threaded your machine up properly. I was going to move my camera to show you how my overhead mast has been threaded, but for some reason it is playing up today, and every time I pick it up and touch it, it cuts my video off, and this is about the 5th time I've started to do this. So I'm going to just not touch it and leave it where it is and hope we're okay. But you have the yarn on. I've got mine on my table behind me. It's actually on my little twiddly gadget here because I've only got a little ball left. Comes up through the wire guide, over the little round tension disc thing, through the wire loop at the front, and then through the overhead spring. Now the idea behind the overhead spring is that you should have enough tension on it for it to form like a shallow, sort of almost sideways D shape as it's knitting, so it's coming down like this. It shouldn't be up in the air and flapping about. It needs, can't really see that, it needs to be making like a shallow arc like that as you're knitting. It's to indicate that you've got enough tension on the yarn. So right, here we go. So as part of your accessories and bits and pieces that came with your machine, you should have several of these. These are the cast on combs that you need to do with this cast on comb method. I find that it's a good idea to have an odd number of needles for this method, so I'm going to bring 20 on this side and 21 on the left out to D position to begin with. My carriage settings are the side levers are back on the triangle and the Russell levers are forward on number 2, and I'm just going to run that carriage across and back to align those needles in B. And then I'm going to get my 1x1 pusher again and push the alternate needles back out of work. And then those left in B position are ready for the cast on. So I make a loop in the end of my yarn and hook it to the clamp on the right hand side under the table, and then I thread it through the machine, and by hooking it to the clamp under the table, it means I've got both hands free to do whatever. The yarn is held, and it also means that the vertical alignment of this thread through the carriage is correct. Because one of the biggest problems that beginners have is that they're holding the yarn underneath. Let me just push those back a minute and move this across. They hold the yarn underneath the carriage. Oops. Like so, and then when they get distracted, their hand wanders off to the side or off over here, and it's then when all of a sudden they discover that the yarn isn't fed through the carriage correctly any longer, and hey presto, their knitting all falls on the floor. So I always hook mine round a clamp. So right, back to selecting my needles again. So I'll have to put those out to B this time, and just put the alternate ones back. So I don't want too many over here. That's it. And so with alternate needles in B position, I can, which is as described here in the book, run the carriage across. There you go. And what you should see now is that there's bars of knitting in the spaces in between the needles, and on these bars you hook your cast on comb. Now try to get it centralised, so I mark the middle of my needle bed with a red felt tip pen, and obviously this slot in the bar here is the centre, so I want that to go roughly in the middle. And I just make sure I've hooked it on all of those bars in between, but without getting caught on the yarn out at the side at the end. There you have it. And then I now get my flat edge of my pusher and push the intermediate needles out to B position and knit back. And that completes the cast on. All done. You can carry on knitting. And that's it, away you go. As I said, I prefer to have an odd number of needles for this cast on because you're pushing the middle ones back. So if you end up casting on with one needle more or less than you need, one more is easier to get rid of, and just take the end needle at the side and transfer it into its neighbour, and that's got rid of that extra needle that you had for your cast on. There we go. And as you can see, you've got these big loops along the edge here. That's not suitable to be used as an edge for a garment, but if you're going to be knitting a tension piece or practicing or changing now over to make a hem, that kind of cast on is perfectly okay. Once you've knitted a few rows of knitting, you'll be able to add your claw weights in. And you can take this comb off if you wish. I do remove them. They're quite unwieldy things, and I prefer to just stick with my claw weights. And so I'll add those on and then carry on knitting. And that's that open edge cast on completed. To remove the knitting, I'm just going to cut it. Take the yarn out of the feeder, unhook it from the clamp, and run the carriage across, and it will just drop off the needles. There we go. So for my second type of open cast on, this is something I've just recently come up with as an adaptation of what is known as a Ravel cord cast on for the metal bed machines that have the metal sinker posts or gate pegs that stick out the front. We'd always considered that this type of cast on wasn't possible on one of these machines because it didn't have sinker posts, which is where you anchor the thread, the Ravel cord, which is this thin nylon stuff. And the cord is used in the way that the comb was on the other type of cast on. The cord is used to secure the loops onto the needles after the first row, so that they're held onto the needles and don't come off the needles out of their hooks and get tangled up, and so stop you from knitting. But I came up with this method fairly recently. Again, I've got my needles in V position. At the beginning on in, I nearly always pull all my needles out to D and then just run across to align them to B. That's just a little habit I've got into, because it then makes sure that the carriage has put them all exactly in B position. You know they're in the right place. Just make sure that your side levers are back and the Russell levers are on 2, because if you have the Russell levers on 1, it won't put them back from D to B. Again, I'm going to make a loop and hook it into the clamp, feed the yarn through the feeder and run one row across. This green yarn isn't the best for showing up on here, is it? So now I'm going to take one extra needle at either end out to D, put the Russell levers back on 1, both of them, and then I'm going to get this Ravel cord and I'm going to wrap it around those 2 needles so that there's a thread running in between. Here it is. Oops, she said probably I'm doing that. And hold it down firmly underneath and knit back. Just make sure that the end needle in B position knits off, which it has. 3. And there we go. I then can take, after 3 or 4 rows, can take the cord away, put these extra needles back out of work, and carry on knitting. And after a few rows again, you've got enough knitting on here to add your claw weights, and then you can just carry on knitting. And there's a really quick way of getting stitches onto the needles, really. So there you go, 2 very quick methods of making a temporary or open cast on onto your machine, say used for practice pieces, for your tension pieces, and the thing I'm going to show you how to do next, which is to knit a hem. So I'm going to leave this piece of knitting on here because when you knit a hem, you always cast on and knit a few rows in waste yarn first. So rather than me take that off and knit another piece in waste yarn, we might as well use that. And then you need to decide how deep you want your hem to be. And I'm going to make mine 10 rows deep. I'm just going to thread up my main yarn up through the other side of the mast. Just hook that on there for a moment. Oops. Yeah, you need to decide how deep you want your hem to be. I'm going to knit mine 10 rows, And I need to start to begin with my carriage on the left-hand side, because the first thing I need to do is to knit a separation row between the waste yarn and the main yarn using the Ravel cord. So I'm going to cut the main yarn, I'll loop it back up here, and then you probably can't see it. I'm just going to put the carriage over on this side for a moment just so you can see where I'm threading this yarn, and then I'll move it back. So the yarn is going to go through, just twiddle this sideways a bit, it's going to, the Ravel cord is going to go through the carriage in exactly the normal way. I'll leave a tail hanging underneath it, and then I will just hold it over the top of the carriage and tension it with my hand. I'm just going to put this back over here. As you can see, it's very easy to release the carriage from the needle bed. So let's thread the cord back through, hand tension it, and knit one row across. And as the knitting starts to, or the carriage starts to bite onto the knitting, you'll feel it in your hand, and just hold the cord steady as it knits across. And there you can see I've got this one row of pink Ravel cord now on top of the green, which is going to be the separation row for my hem. So now I've been knitting this green yarn on stitch size 3 because it's a thinnish double knitting, whereas this is a slightly thicker and slightly coarser double knitting, and would normally knit that on tension 4. But for the first half of my hem, which is the bit that will turn up and become the inside of the hem, you will always knit that at main tension -1. So my main tension for this yarn is 4, so I'm going to leave the thing on 3, which is where it is at the moment, just coincidentally, and I'll put my rustle levers back to 2, and I'm going to knit my 10 rows. And just make sure that because you've got loose ends here, that the first and last stitch is knit off okay. I should have set my row counter. Oops. Never mind, I've just done 2 rows, so I'll set it to 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. Now, I don't know if you can hear as I'm knitting that at the end of every row there's an audible click, and you need to make sure you hear that click before you turn around and come the other way. And it needs to be about a hand's breadth between the edge of the knitting and the carriage before you turn round. If you only take the carriage to there and turn and go back, you stand a chance of either losing your knitting or it just won't knit the row. And if you take it miles over here, you'll lose some of your overhead tension, and then as it comes back, this yarn will go all droopy and you might get a loop at the edge of your knitting. So you need to develop, the optimum point at which you turn and go back. Right, anyway, I digress. Where was I? So I've done my first 10 rows of my hem. Now the next row is going to be the turning row, and that will go at main tension +1. So I'm going to turn it up to 5. Knit one row, and then back down to main tension for the next 10 rows. Now you can see that loose turning row there quite clearly. And so the next thing I need to do is to find here it is on the table, find my, I usually use a 2x1 transfer tool. I'll take the weights off the bottom, and I'm going to pick up that open edge of loops to form the hem. Now the thing to remember when picking up these stitches is that rather than picking up the tops of the stitches, you're picking up the loops underneath. So you will always have one number fewer than you have got stitches on your machine or needles in work. So I'm just going to unhook that from there. And so for that reason, when I pick up this first loop from in between the Ravel cord, the first bottom loop of the main knitting, I will put it on needle 2 and not on needle 1. By doing that, I know I've accounted for the missing inverted commas stitch here, and as I work my way across, picking up these, putting them on needles, if I get to the end and I've got a gap or one too many, then I know that I've somehow picked up, and go back and check it. And when you get nifty at it, you can do 2 at a time, or even 3 at a time, but pride goeth before a fall and all that, so I won't try to do that today. And so you just continue going all the way across, picking up the bottom of your hem stitches. Keep the knitting stretched out with your left hand if you're right-handed, so that you can get those loops at the correct space for your tool. And then over here I've got the last stitch here, just dropped it, and there we have it. I've picked up all of my hem stitches, so just need to put some weights back on here. Just put the claw weights right through and make sure you've got enough. As I said in the introductory video, they get a bit spongy with these weights, so acquire some more if you can, because 2 isn't enough. And yes, you can use these big things as additional weights, but they're quite unwieldy. And there we have it. So you've now got 2 stitches on every single needle except this one at the end, and you can always wrap the tail on there. Clothes pegs are very handy little extras to have, so you can just stick a clothes peg on there to hold it down. And because you've got 2 stitches on the loops, you need to loosen the tension again for the joining row. Otherwise, this is often what happens when people join at their main tension and then wonder why the hem is kicking to the front. So I'm going to turn that up to 5, which is main tension plus 1. And there's my joining row. I might just click it down half a notch for the next row, and then back down to my main tension for the following row. And there you have it. There is your hem knitted. So remove the claw weights. Just got a Ravel cord caught up. I'm going to cut my yarn, remove it, and then just drop it off the machine. Now, to remove the Ravel cord, find the longer end and pull on that. And the knitting should just separate. There we go. So you can either rewind your waste yarn or throw it away, depending on how frivolous you're feeling. And there is your hem. It's not easy to show it perfectly because I've just got a short piece of knitting here, but the best thing to do is to put something through the hem, a ruler or whatever, and then pull it down and steam or press or iron or whatever you're going to do with it. And as you can see, it's a nice hem, and it's not kicking up to the front because the inside of it is on a tighter tension, and then you've got these looser rows here at the joining point. So there we go. Uses for open edge cast on and how to knit a hem. I hope you find that useful.